Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, episode 50. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful. Viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. We welcome you to check out our website and show archive at ChinaDeskPodcast.com. You can always access our podcasts at thefederalnewswire.com as well. My guests today are Jim Fanell and Bradl Thayer. Captain James Fanell is a government fellow within the Global Fellowship Initiative of the Geneva Centre for Security Policy. He spent nearly 30 years in naval intelligence. He has served as Director of Intelligence and Information Operations for the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence for the U.S. 7th Fleet aboard the USS Blue Ridge, the Office of Naval Intelligence China Senior Intelligence Officer, and as the Senior Intelligence Officer for the USS Kitty Hawk Aircraft Carrier Strike Group. Dr. Bradl Thayer is a contributor to Steve Bannon's War Room and founding member of the Committee on Present Danger China. He is co-author of many books, including Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure, Understanding the China Threat, and How China Sees the World. In the book, America's Greatest Strategic Failure, our guests articulate how for decades the United States has underestimated the threat from the People's Republic of China and left our country vulnerable and at risk of losing its dominant position in global politics. They illuminate how this happened and what can be done to reverse course. Jim and Brad, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in. Well, with each of you, I mentioned, I sort of forewarned, each episode, we like to talk a little bit about the human beings before we get into the experts. Jim, since you have the rank of captain, I'll go first with you. When you were growing up, did you just think, one day I'm going to be one of our nation's leading intelligence analysts and I'm going to write books and talk about the threat from communist China?
Well, thanks for having us on, Steve, and it's a great honor. I grew up in California, all over the state, but mostly in Southern California, and I had no idea that I'd ever join the Navy. I was at San Diego State University, and it was during the Reagan years, and America was on the rise, and Reagan made America great, and he made the Navy look great, and it was in the same year of Top Gun and all that, and that seemed to be something that I really wanted to do, go out and see the world, and so I decided to join the Navy, and I wore glasses and probably wasn't going to be flying fighter jets or things of that nature. So I wanted to go into something that was similar to what I was studying in history and political science. So I chose to go into intelligence and was fortunate enough to have a career in naval intelligence. And it was a great experience.
And I also had the glasses thing, but surgery kind of magically took those away from me at one point, but definitely could not be trusted to fly fighter jets. But when I look at entering the intelligence world from the 80s going into the 90s, China wasn't exactly front of center for most of our leaders through that experience. Talk a little bit about where along that arc China sort of rose into prominence and concern for you.
Yeah, in 1986, when I was commissioned, there was only one threat, and that was the Soviet Union. And we were all bore-sighted on the Soviet naval threat as naval officers, and everything we did was about sinking the Soviet Navy and thinking about the Soviet Navy and studying the Soviet threat. But then the wall came down and the Soviet Union dissolved. And I found myself in Hawaii at the Joint Intelligence Center there, and I was assigned to the watch, which is in naval parlance is you're on a 24/7 watch floor where you're looking at what's happening at sea, whether it's whatever country it is, wherever you're stationed in that global enterprise that we had back then at the fall of the Soviet Union, which was called the Ocean Surveillance Information System, OSIS. We had a global system to follow the Soviets. And at that time, that's where young officers, like I was a lieutenant, JG, and then a lieutenant, I was wanting to be on the watch to follow the Soviet Navy and the Soviet ballistic missile submarine force. And I did that, but my stepping stone into that was to follow the Chinese Navy. So in around 1990, 91, I got assigned to the watch and I started following the Chinese Navy. But at that time, we only followed the North Sea Fleet because there was no really East Sea Fleet and South Sea Fleet to speak of. And they only had a couple of handful of nuclear submarines, Han-class SSNs, and one Ja-class SSBN that had only fired once, attempted to fire one ballistic missile that didn't really go well. So that was the only little thing that I was responsible for until I got to follow the Soviet Navy. And then from there, it was another decade plus until basically 1999 when I got reassigned to the U.S. Pacific Fleet headquarters, where really following China became a full-time job. And this was after the 95-96 missile crisis. And by 1999, if you're in Hawaii or West, you recognize that the Chinese Navy and the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party were going to be a problem, a big problem.
Well, I think that's part of the arc narrative that we definitely want to jump into, of how the strategic vision started to change, awareness began to change. I had a seat in a part of the intelligence community through that end of Cold War into the new era, and I was a China analyst, a language analyst, and all the Sovietologists were pouring into our side of the world because they needed employment and the Cold War was over. At least that's the way a young person saw it back in those times. And I was also told it's the economy, stupid. And all of our national security apparatus was meant to reorient around the economy around the beginning of the Clinton administration. And those were some searing experiences of watching that transition. But that's just sort of act one of this drama that I'm hoping you can help us walk through. But before we get too deep on the substance, Brad, I guess when you were growing up, you said, hey, I want to be a distinguished author and researcher on things having to do with national security in China.
Well, Steve, it's great to join you. And thanks for the opportunity and the support with your great crew. In essence, that was it, Steve. I was always interested.
You're the first guest on the China Deck to say that. So congratulations.
Yeah. I was always interested, of course, in diplomatic history, military history as a boy. And really the study of great power politics is something which has occupied a lot of my academic career. And so certainly it was an aspect of my interest from the outset. Additionally, I'm very interested in communist thought and looking at the similarities between what was generated in 1917 in what would become the Soviet Union and then spread or metastasized, more accurately, throughout the world, including to China. And so I was always fascinated by the idea of having China led by a Western ideology and the paradoxes associated with that for the communist regime. So, yes, Steve, it's been a great interest of mine. I would say, though, Jim's friends have told me since I was not in the military, I have an honorary rank of a DAC or DAC or dumbass civilian. So I wear that as a badge of honor.
I might have one of those too. I don't know. Maybe the award was lost in the mail. Well, we've got a lot of meat to cover, but I also want to talk a little bit about the recent book and what brought the two of you together to tackle this subject, and how did that collaboration work out for the two of you? Jim, why don't you start us off?
Well, I was going to say, why don't you let Brad start that, since he's the impetus for the book.
He's the scribe. Okay. So Brad, take it away.
Well, Steve, Jim and I see the world largely in the same way with respect to the questions that animated the book and the necessary responses to it. And so we have divergent backgrounds, of course, as we've described, but complement each other in many respects. So Jim and I were both puzzled by a fundamental issue, which is how is it that the People's Republic of China could grow from having a fraction of 1% of world gross domestic product in 1990 to having about 19% before COVID, right, in 2019. That should not have happened without having any type of U.S. response to it. And so we're coming at the question in a related but also in different ways. And so that allowed us to sit down and to generate the book, which Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure, which does precisely that. Why did we embrace Communist China? And why was that our greatest strategic failure? So those are the issues that we explore in the book, and we do so in an excellent and very complimentary way. But we were both fundamentally challenged by what we identify in the book as threat deflation.
Yeah.
Why is it that
I want to draw out that concept?
Right. Consistently, year after year, we underestimated the threat from the People's Republic of China.
So, Jim, why don't you kick off how we underestimated, and then I'll turn it back to you, Brad, about why we underestimated. But Jim, we talk about you had a front row seat to a lot of analysis and conversations. You saw how things might be understated or missed.
Well, yeah, and Brad's articulation of the thesis was something that just, resonated with me as when we first began talking about the book. And it was my life experience in naval intelligence and the larger intelligence community working on China. And basically this idea of threat deflation is generated out of this, what we call the engagement school. So there was a group of people that we call the engagers. You've probably heard of them. These are the people that came out of the Kissinger-Nixon visits in the early 70s and then transitioned into the Carter administration recognition and then the Clinton administration's admission of the Chinese into the World Trade Organization and subsequent decades, where we just had a national security community in Washington that believed in this idea that if we engage with China, we will transform them into being more like us. And there was never any conception that by engaging with China, communist China, which we were never allowed to say, they could change us. But in fact, that's what we did. And so in the intelligence community, those engagers, whether they were in the State Department, whether they were in the senior positions in the Defense Department, whether they were in the think tanks in Washington or elsewhere, the engagers put forward this thesis that I just described, that if we engage, things will get better. And that translated down into the intelligence community. And I remember, I spent 4 years in the U.S. Pacific Fleet headquarters from 99 to 03. Then I went forward to the USS Kitty Hawk from 03 to 05, where I'm on the front door watching the Chinese militarize and grow their Navy and grow their military. And then I come back in 2006 to the Office of Naval Intelligence, and I've got line analysts, civilian analysts at the Office of Naval Intelligence they're telling me, well, you can't say this about China. We don't know this about China. Oh, they're never going to have an aircraft carrier program. And so I came from the front lines where we were viscerally aware of the threat, and we could see it growing every day. And then I come back to Washington and I see a community that's afraid to say anything about China because that's the vibe that was put out from the senior leadership of the intelligence community, not just the Navy, but all the IC writ large, in defense, at Langley, and other areas. And so it was really stunning to see that this idea that we would continue to look at the Chinese and the Chinese Communist Party in a way that was non-threatening. And we were engaged. We were sold this idea of engagement, and it was only through the Chinese, to be honest. It wasn't through anything that people like me or others warned about. It was only when it became so plainly obvious did we start to see a change when the Trump administration came in, and that's kind of what we described throughout the book.
Well, I completely identify with and agree with the idea that it was only when reality mugged us that people started to take this for what it is. And the evidence was there. You saw it, others saw it too. And boy, it wasn't just leaders in the IC and elsewhere. Presidents of the United States would echo these kinds of things. And those are command directives that are coming down telling people I was elected to do this. And that's hard to try to overcome with evidence. But Brad, a few other things about this kind of tamping down of the threat. One is just, why would we do that?
Well, it's a great question, Steve, and that absolutely gets to the heart of it. Because it should not have happened. Great powers have risen before: Japan after 1868, Germany after 1871. But those powers were met with balancing, either within the European system or broadly European and Asian system by other powers. The US did not balance China, in fact, because it was largely co opted by it. And we explained three reasons why this occurred. First was the end of history moment. Steve, Jim and I are old enough to remember the Cold War and the halcyon days of its end, and the recognition that really we were in a new era. And great power politics was a thing of the past, and the future was going to be defined by democracy and free market economics. And Fukuyama's idea, of course, was terribly influential and helped contribute to threat deflation. Secondly, was administrative policies. It was the idea that Wall Street and investment into the PRC, allowing China into our economic ecosystem, helping them with manufacturing, essentially offshoring from our manufacturing to China, was hugely influential in creating a vested interest in engagement with China. And again, by engaging with China, because we were at the end of history, right, we were going to reform them. They were going to change, and communism would fall away at some point in time, and they would become woven into our system. And then lastly, of course, it was Deng Xiaoping's political warfare strategy, where Jim and I called Deng Xiaoping the greatest strategist of the 20th century. And the reason why we call him the greatest strategy of the 20th century is because he was able to save the Chinese Communist Party at a time where communism had failed. The Soviet Union had died, and in Central and Eastern Europe, it had fallen away as well. He was very worried about regime change, that the Bush administration might do what it had done or was thinking about in Baghdad. That also might happen in Beijing. So he was expert in being able to avoid the mistakes of the Soviet Union while making U.S. the partner in the survival and growth of the Chinese Communist Party, which is what he did by weaving the Communist Party into Western manufacturing, Wall Street practices, and then converting that into wealth that was converted to political influence, to think tanks in Washington, D.C. Steve, you know that well, how many think tanks have taken money from the Chinese Communist Party. Universities, again, you know how many universities have taken money. Media. So what he did was successfully generated the survival of the Chinese Communist Party. And more than that, he put it on the pathway to receiving the rocket fuel that allowed China to become our peer competitor and to challenge us in many ways far more successfully than the Soviets were able to do so.
Well, Brad, that's a very powerful thesis, one that happens to add the added virtue of being true, and yet it is not talked about very much in academic circles that I'm aware of. I'm not the best plugged in person. I'm probably not even considered an academic by academics anymore. But when you think about how the declaration you made of Deng Xiaoping being this important, I mean, Deng saved the Communist Party from extinction twice. I mean, the Cultural Revolution should have destroyed the Communist Party, and Deng was vital in bringing it up from those ashes. And after Tiananmen Square, with the global media seeing the Communist Party for what it was, Deng succeeded in saving it again and guiding it through that era and continuing engagement. It was, in some ways, it was evil, but it was masterful politics from their point of view. And I'm amazed all these decades later. Yours is the only thesis I've heard expressed this way. Have you found this to be challenged or marginalized among polite society?
Well, we have two elements there, Steve. One, which is first, the argument, as you observed, has a virtue for people who've lived through it of being true in essence, right? And that says we're on to essentially the causes of our greatest strategic failure that needs to be explained, and people are receptive to that because a lot of folks are looking around and saying, "How did this happen? How is it that we've gone from essentially not having appeared of being challenged in every respect in our technology and space exploration, militarily, diplomatically, economically, as you know well, Steve. But secondly, negatively, of course, there is still the engagement school and its power, Steve, which will not yield on this point, right? For the engagement school, Moses brought down 11 commandments, not 10 commandments from Mount Sinai. And the 11th commandment was, thou shalt engage with communist China. And that's never going to be addressed. And we can see whether the presidential candidates or whether they're in Congress or on K Street or law firms or elsewhere, Wall Street, the desire is to maintain that engagement with communist China. And the Biden administration has, as Jim and I call it, neo-engagement, where we saw the sordid events of last year, where we saw almost everyone in the Biden administration go to Beijing and take a knee. You had a Secretary of Commerce who said nothing could imperil the relationship that we have with the Chinese Communist Party. So the strength, if you will, at the elite level of the engagement school is still very difficult to challenge successfully.
Well, Jim, I want to turn back to you and draw out another part of your work that I think is very, very important contribution to the conversation. And that is how important political or information warfare has been in the era and perhaps the solution in the future. But let's talk still in the analysis and assessment part of the era. Political warfare has been a core part of what communist parties have been about and done. It has been ongoing throughout the period of engagement, but has almost never talked about. I remember being almost explicitly told that the C of communism and CCP is just for show. It's not real. These are really capitalists. The world is changing, but there's no such thing as ideology in our policy. Is more or less what I was told by professors and my superiors in government from time to time. But in your testimony in this book together, you've talked about the important spillover of this information warfare and the national security realities you were witnessing. Can you help articulate better than I how these worlds came together? What was new or different about it that we need to take more seriously?
Well, Steve, I'm not sure I can articulate it better than you just have, but my experience is exactly the same, which is to say political warfare or this idea that we're fighting an ideology was verboten. It was never brought up. 1999, 2000, 2010, no one was ever talking about Chinese Communist Party ideology. And if they did, if they ever raised it, they were immediately smacked down with the Chinese. They're not really communists. They just want to buy and sell and trade. They're just capitalists, but with Chinese characteristics. And so that's part of this dang strategy. It seeped in. It took pervasive hold over our mindset, and it made us less aware of the threat that was growing. And so we refused to believe that they were really communists until it became quite obvious that they really were. I like to, Miles Yu is in the last administration. He's been very clear about writing about from Mao until Xi, there really hasn't been a change in any one of the 5 paramount leaders of the Chinese Communist Party. They all have had the same intended end state. It's just a matter of where they were in that arc of history in terms of the power that they had to be able to achieve it. And it's only since Xi's been in power that he's had the power of the economy. He's had the power of the PLA. He's had the power of diplomacy, wolf warriors, and other things to be able to move forward in this political warfare. And they've been very adept at it. We can talk about Confucius Institutes. We can talk about United Front worker departments that are, all across this country actively working. We can talk about their diplomats that are here in the country that collaborate with Americans, like the National Commission on U.S.-China Relations. I'll just mention them because they collaborate with the Chinese Communist Party to help promote the Chinese Communist Party's ideology and end states in America. We have things like TikTok. We have, fentanyl isn't really technically, I guess, a political warfare tool, but it is being used in that way to undergird or to undercut America's national security. And it comes across in many forms in our universities and other areas where we're told that the Chinese aren't a threat, the Chinese aren't a problem, and it's us that's the problem. It's us that's the unilateralists. Yet we see the Chinese Communist Party act unilaterally in every domain of national power. And so it's really something that it's part of this greatest failure is that we did not understand, and we write about this in the book, we don't really understand Chinese communist ideology. We didn't really attribute it to these leaders. We didn't really attribute that they were on an agenda on a specific timeline. Instead, you'd hear things like, oh, well, they take the long view. They're 100 years down the road. They're going to kick the can down the road. And we didn't understand that they actually were on an ideological timeline to restore China to what they believe is their proper place in world history and their proper position in global dominance. And that timeline is ticking away, and we're running out of time as they go to achieve their great restoration, or as Xi calls it, the great rejuvenation.
Well, I think that this theme is so incredibly important, and I think this threat deflation idea is something that people really need to sink their teeth into, because, at least in my estimation, it started in threat deflation about military platforms and the nature of a geostrategic challenge, but it is happening here in our homeland. And one of the greatest successes of political warfare by the Chinese Communist Party is getting Americans to do things to themselves. And the Chinese don't even have to do their own kind of political warfare activity. In my estimation, it was Hong Kongers that brought down the pillars of independence and freedom in Hong Kong without the Red Guard having to do that much in this. And they basically get our own people to degrade our own institutions and allow a threat to spread. And I've lived through this just on the fentanyl stuff. I think fentanyl is a political weapon that they are knowingly engaged in using. I think it's a part of a broader strategy to dumb down, divide, and destroy what should be the most employable, recruitable, innovative generation of Americans, the generation of Americans that would overcome what China wants to try to bring out into the world. But if you can hypnotize them with TikTok, kill them with fentanyl, and flood them with disjointed images and distractions of all other kinds, you're basically getting America to take itself off the playing field. My daughter was killed by fentanyl. There's hundreds of thousands of families that have lost loved ones through this. And I still see people who are Americans repeating CCP points about, oh no, this isn't collaboration with the cartels. This has nothing to do with the border. And you Americans need to control your own drug problem. And to me, it still blows me away that we have such a large population of a willing audience to just say, oh yeah, the problem is us. And isn't that just success and political warfare by the CCP, that they could get us to engage and open up and give them privileged opportunity, and we'll blame ourselves for our problems? That's checkmate.
Mm-hmm.
So Brad, you're the thinker among us. I'm not dissing what Jim might be contributing to the conversation or me, but help us understand now, okay, strategically, policy-wise, what do we need to begin doing now that we've assessed that we're in a hole, and the hole is in part of our own making? What do we need to do now to turn to the prescriptive side of things to give us some sunshine at the end of this tunnel, that this glass is half empty, but we can fill in parts of this if we're so willing? How do we begin doing that?
Well, Steve, Jim and I would like to send our condolences for your loss. I too have known colleagues who've lost children, or friends who've lost children to fentanyl. So it is it's a devilish problem, and it's by design.
Yeah.
This is an intent. They're here to kill us, and that's what their objective is. So that's a point that we need to recognize. Everything is at stake in this fight with our enemy. And we stress in the book, we need to call them the enemy, right? They're not pure. They are the enemy of the American people and of the United States of America. But there's great reason for optimism, Steve. At the same time, great reason for optimism because who they are and who we are. So the Chinese Communist Party is an illegitimate government, right? They should not be. They're a product of really the Comintern. They're a product of Joseph Stalin and his ability really to forge through and to protect for his own interests communism in China. And so when we recognize that, we can recognize that the Chinese people never voted for this. They never consented to the Chinese Communist Party. And the Chinese Communist Party has driven China into the ground and have ruled with such an iron fist and kill scores of millions of Chinese people because their regime is illegitimate. And wherever communism shows up, death and destruction follow. So it's not a surprise it's in China as well. Because they are illegitimate, they are fiercely insecure, and they are quite clear in terms of what their strategic objective is, which is to destroy other centers that would pose any type of barrier to their hegemony. And that's the United States of America, which is why, for ideological reasons, the US has to be killed by any means necessary. And they're employing every means that they can, as you observed, in terms of allowing us to lose confidence and really our identity. But who are we? We're Americans, right? We are filled with the spirit of 1776 to this day. We have an ideology and a society which is the envy of the world. Many, many tens of millions of people are seeking to come into the West, to the United States, to live in this society. It is the ideology and the economic system that provide the greatest freedom for individuals and the greatest fulfillment to allow individuals to live their lives as they so choose. And that remains with us to this day. So our greatest strength is our ideology, our society, our civilization, which they're supremely jealous of. They're supremely envious of what we've created. And that allows us to recognize our strength is among ourselves. And when we recognize what we've accomplished, what our ancestors, right, were the progeny of great men and women who've gone through difficulties, hardships before, but have weathered them, have dealt with great crises and wars before, but again have survived them and thrived, we can recognize that we have the right ideology for the maximization of human well-being, of human freedom and human liberty in international politics. And were this to end, right, if, heaven forbid, the United States were to fall, right, then the lamp of liberty, the light of freedom would be extinguished in international politics. And for the billionaires who think they're going to have their bolt hole in New Zealand, or they're going to live in Switzerland and everything is going to be fine, they're going to find that the Communist Party of China, right, is not going to tolerate any resistance, and certainly not from weaker states or weaker entities. So when we recognize that, it's time for the world to unite against the Chinese Communist Party. That's the people of China, that's the Chinese diaspora, as well as people who embrace freedom around the world, including the U.S., its allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific foremost. So, Steve, there's reason for great optimism because they're going to fail. If we could cut them off from the investment and the trade that we give them, then they're on their way. They're already in dire economic circumstances, Steve, as I know you've covered many times. This is something that could really push them out and allow us to recognize that the Chinese people can do much better and forge a far stronger and, if you will, truly Chinese polity rather than relying on a Soviet knockoff.
Yeah, Brad, I really appreciate the optimistic vision, and I want the audience to kind of get that the point of your work together in this book is not just the negative case about communist China, but the positive vision of what the world can be if we get things right. And I fervently believe in that. I think American revival is the first prerequisite to meeting and overcoming this challenge. Throwing a dash of telling the truth and being comfortable living with the truth is a nice way forward. Jim, if I could turn back to you a little bit about the economics that Brad was alluding to in the context of national security, the bet that was made that was very, very bad put us in immense dependency relationships that took decades to go deep on, and now are very costly and painful to try to undo. In our China Desk conversations, we try to talk about a concept of reciprocity possibly being a gateway to how to think about rebalancing these economic relationships for those that are not ready for a full reprogram or break with these past patterns. For those of us who've suffered from this, we're ready to break now. But not a lot of the rest of the world or our own country isn't ready for that yet. What role do you see in the supply chain reshoring, or this concept of a reciprocal doctrine as a way to get us back to a more manageable set of options?
Well, Steve, first of all, I want to say I use the term political warfare regarding fentanyl as a kind of a description, because for me, fentanyl is kinetic warfare.
Yeah.
So that to me, when I talk about fentanyl, it is full out warfare against us. It's killing Americans. And over the last 5-6 years, we've lost more Americans to fentanyl as we did in World War II. And so it's a devastating, full on war. So I just wanted to explain that. In terms of this economic question, as Brad and I write in the book, we recommend full decoupling, because every dollar that is spent in China, whether it's invested by Apple or Boeing or GE or, you name the country, you name the BMW, VW, it's all going in to achieve the Chinese Communist Party's main goal, which is to become the global superpower that dominates every aspect of life. And so if we thought that we had it bad during COVID in America, just look what was going on in the People's Republic of China. You couldn't leave your apartment without scanning a code. You couldn't go into across the street without the crosswalk interrogating your phone to make sure that you had the vaccination or that you weren't contagious. You couldn't go into a store. They had 100% control of 1.4 billion people's lives. They have the technology, they're a totalitarian state, and they want to export that globally around the world. That's why Xi talks about the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative. They have global aspirations, not just for China. And so if we don't want that, we have to stop giving them money. We just saw this last week. Apple is now no longer the top selling smartphone in China. It's now Chinese companies. So the smart, brilliant Tim Cook and all those experts that get millions of dollars working on his staff that said we got to keep investing in China, they're idiots. And I don't say that lightly. I know they're very smart people and educated and know how to run businesses, but they didn't understand the fundamental issue, which is you're going into a system that wants to take over your business, and they will do everything that they can. And we're watching that happen across all facets of business. So when we talk about reciprocity, there's only one reciprocity. Quit dealing with them. Get out now, cut your losses, and escape with your life. Because if you stay in there, you're going to lose your business. We've already seen the impact of that in America. That's why a guy like J.D. Vance is a vice presidential candidate for Donald Trump, because he's lived that. He's an expression of what happened to America's Rust Belt when all of our jobs were exported to China and people were dying from opioids and other things and no employment. And so we've got to stop this, because every dollar that we give them goes into building a DF-21D anti-carrier ballistic missile, or a DF-17 hypersonic missile, or a new SSBN, or a new SSN, nuclear attack submarine, or ballistic missile submarine, or some new space launch vehicle that's going to attack our satellites in space and be able to take out our ability to buy, sell, and trade with our communications networks up there. We can go across a whole litany of things, but we're funding them, and we've got to stop funding our enemy. As Brad says in the book, the number one rule of great power politics is you don't give your enemy money to kill you. You don't fund them. And we haven't learned that. So they are the enemy. They are trying to kill us and destroy us. And we have to stop the insanity of giving them the ammunition to turn around and shoot us.
Well, one of the ironies of kind of observing and participating in these conversations over the years is that the Chinese Communist Party isn't really shy about having engaged in strategic decoupling itself. And so, once again, we're in an exercise where evidence is there, and we have some kind of a mind game going on our side to ignore or deflate what we are seeing with our own eyes by way of evidence. But as we kind of transition through towards a conclusion, number one, I also want to thank you guys for making very, very clear that the Communist Party of China isn't even based. I mean, really, the C word in that doesn't work is the China part. There is nothing Chinese about communist ideology. And this was a failed ideology almost everywhere else. And it's really just about naked power and control at this point. But that is not what traditional China was always about. And so there's nothing Chinese about this. And at some point, I pray the Chinese people are reawakened to their own Chineseness. And will, they'll have the critical mass to deal with. Until then, we've got to contain these malign influences and protect our way of life. We've talked about a number of different elements of what I see as the highlights of your book and the testimonies that you've given on these things. But surely I might have missed an item or two that, of course, because I'm a fantastic questioner, I forgot to ask you something very, very important. But as we come down to a close, Brad, why don't you take first swing at what's kind of an important part of this work that we didn't get into the conversation you want to make sure the audience hears?
Well, Steve, thank you so much. You've done an excellent job summarizing the book and taking the audience through it. One point that I would emphasize would be that what we lost was what our grandfathers, grandmothers, our parents gave us, which was a period of stability which should have lasted for a very long time. And we lost that. It was the, if you will, the avarice of Wall Street, coupled with what the Clinton administration did to open the floodgates to allow investment trade with the Chinese Communist Party, that really cost us a period of stability that we should have had in international politics. Many, many people sacrificed and died to give the United States a victory in the Cold War, and that was simply swept away so that a billionaire could have a fifth house and a third yacht and a fifth private aircraft, right? I mean, it was the inheritance of the American people who sacrificed for the victory in the Cold War, victories in World War II, then victories in the Cold War. And that stability should have lasted. Our position in international politics should have lasted longer, but instead of listening to great strategists like Andy Marshall, for example, and that coterie of folks who understood and tried to warn us, we were captured by financiers, right? By the economists who told us, well, great power politics is a thing of the past. It's old think, and new think is it's a globalized world. The world is flat, right? And we're all going to get rich, and it doesn't matter where products or where money flows. So, Steve, the loss of our birthright was something, and the loss of what people, so many had sacrificed for, going through the hard days of the Cold War against the Soviet Union and against China, right? We want to remember that 36,000 Americans were killed in Korea, a small number by Soviets who were flying MiG-15s, obviously, against us, but mostly by the Chinese communists. We also want to remember that over 1,000 American airmen, naval aviators, and Marines were killed in the skies over North Vietnam, a small number again by the Soviets running the SAM sites, but largely by AAA sites run by the Chinese. So we want to recognize the Cold War was hot, and we fought China in the course of the Cold War. But that knowledge really was lost to us. And it was lost overnight by folks who simply threw out everything, ran to embrace avarice, which made a small number of people supremely wealthy, but the cost of that, of course, were shared by American society. And those individuals saved the essentially the existence of the Chinese Communist Party. And so, Steve, recognizing what we lost and recognizing what we might have had if we'd sustained and listened to the strategist is very painful. But that's a recognition that needs to be certainly made.
Well, thank you, Brad. Jim, over to you. Same kind of question. Any important part of the research or work that you've been doing that you want to make sure the audience is aware of that we didn't cover?
Yeah, Steve, to complement what Brad said, this great legacy that we had from our forefathers and forebears, it will require us today to dig deep and to do a great work. And so it's not going to be easy. And, these people that were the threat deflators, they are now, strangely enough, they deflated and said there was no threat from the PRC for decades. And now all of a sudden, in the last couple of years, these same people are now the defeatists. They're saying the threat's too great, there's nothing we can do, and we must engage some more so that we can get favorable conditions in this truce with the Chinese Communist Party. But we reject that. And so we try to point out that we need to get back to the basics. And this week, Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has an article out in Foreign Affairs talking about how, by 2025 or 2030, 60% of our 40 or 60% of the military will be drones and AI and all this. There is a penchant inside our national security community to try to take the cheap way out, to try to do this with green eye shade and say, well, there'll never be enough money. Instead of saying, no, we need to get back to basics. And we need to compete with the Chinese in the military arena in hard power, kinetic hard power. We need a bigger fleet. We need a bigger air force. We need a bigger rocket force. We need a more secure space constellation. And we need a secure cyber arena and domain for our critical infrastructure. And people say, well, you can't compete with them. They're so much bigger than us. Well, just look at the Olympics. Look at the medal count. Who's got more gold medals? Who's got more silver medals? Who's got more bronze medals? Who's got more medals? It's the United States of America. So when we set our attention to do something, we can defeat the Chinese Communist Party, and we don't have to live in fear of, well, they're going to outspend us like we outspent the Soviets. We can be smarter, we can work harder, but we need to have the capacity to match their expansive military capabilities. In the last month, they've had bombers flying through the Gulf of Alaska's air defense identification zone. Before that, just for a week before, they had surface action groups, combatants, warships. They have exercises in Belarus. They've got exercises in Tanzania right now. They're dominating the South China Sea on a daily basis. They're sending their ships into the Mediterranean, into the Atlantic, into the Baltic. They're operating closer to Guam, closer to Hawaii. They're operating off of Australia. They're operating off of South America. They're operating in the Atlantic. And yet we have people that say, well, we're going to defeat this with drones and unmanned vehicles. No, that's part of it. But we shouldn't forget what is required throughout history is hard kinetic power. And we need that. And that means we have to reorder the way we spend money in the U.S. government. We have to reorient away from 40 years of focusing on the central command in the Middle East. And we need to get back to, as Brad mentioned earlier, a balanced military approach to global survival and success, which means a strong naval force, a strong air force, along with the strong ground force. And we have neglected that in favor of focusing in exclusively on the Middle East for too long. There was reasons for that. I'm not condemning that, but we need to get back to a balanced approach. And we need to recognize that America survives because we have safe borders, and those are ocean borders. And those are being threatened today, and they'll be much worse if we do nothing in the next coming decades.
Well, I think that's a great punchline to keep everyone's attention focused on. I especially love the reference to borders, often forgotten. People just don't have a sense. I'm aware of who I'm talking to and that you know this better than I ever will, but there's an awful lot of life that takes place on those waters that all of us land dwellers have no idea about. And so there's a lot of our national interests at stake there. I want to encourage our audience to follow your work and commentary. I'll start with you, Brad. Where should people go to track your comments and research and good work?
Well, Jim and I write a weekly column for American Greatness, and so folks can go to American Greatness every week and see our writings. But I'm at Bradl Thayer on Getter and Bradl Thayer at Truth and Brad Thayer at X. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Jim, same drill. Where do people go to follow your wisdom and insights?
Well, I don't really do social media, Steve. So I just I work with Brad on the weekly column with American Greatness, and I have a private list that we talked about before we broadcasted. I don't usually publicize for people to join, but I try to stay active and communicate with people. And if you find a way to reach out to me, we can talk about that list. But thanks for having us on. It's been a great conversation.
Well, the pleasure is mine. And I think those conversations are incredibly important to try to grow and thrive organically. It's an awful lot of our dominant national and international narrative that is out there that is just not based on the reality we spent the last period of time discussing. I want to encourage our audience, if you have enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing and visit ChinaDeskPodcast.com. Thank you for joining. A special thank you to Captain James Fanell and Dr. Bradl Thayer for sharing their perspectives. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.